Welcome to Meld, a podcast brought to you by Maz and Iman, a stream of consciousness, conversational style podcast with visionaries building the future of Web3. No topics are off limits.
So yeah, I've been was revisiting some of the essays, and obviously Iman was as well, and then was revisiting the book. So your essay on decentralization, autonomy, and organization, published in the Radical Friends book. You basically mentioned, like, from the age of 16 or so, like, your participation with direct groups that were somewhat like anti-capitalist or anti-globalization type groups. And how, like, I guess decentralization and the use of affinity groups enabled like better decision making and operations and so on. Let's go into that a little bit, or even if you want to go further before that as well, up to you.
Let's go into that. I mean, I think it's relevant to the kind of space of Web3 for quite a few different reasons. I mean, first of all, like you mentioned, a lot of the kind of ideas around the benefits of decentralization and organizing in a decentralized way, you see those echo, from, those social movements and then through to the way that people talk about the tech today, including things like censorship resistance and, the ability to kind of be resilient in the face of like attempted shutdowns and this kind of thing. So I think that's like super interesting. But then there's also the more personal thing. And I mean, you're saying you want to go into the personal stuff. So like I can talk a little bit about that because it does inform, the way that I write, especially about decentralization. So as you said, I got involved in radical anti-capitalist politics from quite a young age. And, I think like I just had, for whatever reason, a kind of strong reaction to, what I perceived as injustices happening in the world, right? And at that time, which was the 90s, this was a period of time when you saw kind of large institutions like the IMF and World Bank, global institutions roll out a series of policies that forced kind of economies around the world to adopt neoliberal economic policies. And they did that through various kind of lending programs. And so, there was this kind of reaction, a global reaction from social movements towards that was very much, for a kind of, it was, let's say, a democratic reaction to that. So it was a reaction that said, look, countries and communities should have the ability to decide themselves what kind of policies and what kind of economics they want to operate on. And also, we are already seeing the destructive effects of capitalism in, the way that hyper-industrialization destroys environments and destroys local communities and forcibly displaces people from local communities into, new types of working arrangements and exploitation. And so this was a kind of, that's the kind of broad brush strokes of what this movement was about. It was anti-globalization in the particular form that globalization was taking at that time, which was neoliberal globalization, and neoliberalism being a set of policies that are about deregulation of markets and basically expansion of market dynamics into all aspects of social and political life. And so, it was kind of it's a way to kind of see, and for me, like my political formation within that set of movements, like kind of put up a stark. Well, first of all, it awoke a kind of interest in political economy in general. So, I started looking into political economy and eventually studied that. But it also put up a kind of stark understanding of, different versions of decentralization, right? There's a kind of form of decentralization that connects very much to democracy and direct democracy, and the ability for people to make informed decisions about how they want to live together. And then a form of decentralization that has to do with market decentralization, where there is the assumption that humans cannot actually coordinate among themselves and need a kind of external force to enable coordination at scale. And that external force should be markets, because markets is the kind of, so the theory goes, markets is a rational distribution mechanism. And so it was kind of at that time, that was essentially in a nutshell, that was kind of a big part of the conflict, right, around the anti-globalization movement. And so, these themes obviously continue to echo and cycle through kind of the work that I'm doing now too. And I find it so interesting in the Web3 space to see how these two versions of decentralization, are so scrambled, right? And people draw, from one or the other at different times, and they experiment with new mixes. But I do think there's a severe lack of education around like where these versions of decentralization come from historically and intellectually. And so I think like there's a lot of kind of reading and study to do in the Web3 space to understand, what are the lessons that can be learned from history. Some of this stuff has been tried out before. What are the problems that have come up before, and how are what we're building now potentially going to reproduce those problems in different ways? But yeah, I'm kind of, so this is the kind of my compass, let's say, for navigating what's happening in the Web3 space, that you have, these two versions of decentralization that are coming together in kind of weird and wonderful ways. And, I think it's really important to try and unpack that and see, how can we kind of move forward in the best way.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said in this essay was like, it's like as if we came up with the right diagram, we would then have the answers in a sense, right? It's like everyone's stand around, let's come up with the right diagram, and then we know how to execute without this kind of level of context, historical understanding of what these concepts actually mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that you mentioned the diagram, because the diagram is another thing that has been a big theme also in informing how I kind of went about writing my PhD. And it's and also that I wrote a kind of commentary in the Bitcoin white paper that was also published as a book, and that was also very much like talking about the Bitcoin white paper as a diagram, and as a fantastic and fascinating diagram. That it's almost as if it puts up this mental model, right, about how we can solve all problems once and for all finally. And it's like I think there's something interesting that happens when people engage with diagrams, which is you become so fascinated by the simplicity of the solution that you lose track of what the reality actually looks like when you start to implement, right? And being able to distinguish between, what is a beautiful mental model and what's actually taking place in reality is another really important skill, right? And the ability to be honest about what's taking place in reality, because the mental model can sometimes be so convincing and so perfect that people don't want to look at what's happening in reality. That maybe that that beautiful idea of decentralization is actually not quite working out that way, right? And the effects are not the effects that you were hoping to get from it. So yeah, I think diagrams and mental models is something that is in the Web3 space operates very powerfully, and whether that is like in the form of the short Bitcoin white paper or the network, Paul Baran's network diagram that also constantly gets circulated, the one that just the three panes that have the decentralization, distributed, and centralization, which is it's I could go on and on for hours on that diagram alone.
And if it's possible to explain the context of the diagram, I think a lot of people don't necessarily have the depth of insight looking at the history of what market decentralization means, how that has evolved over time, and similarly for the political side and spectrum. And by actually looking into history and understanding what has changed, what were the factors, why certain behaviors came out almost, you could argue, in an inevitable way. It's almost like running multiple simulations at the same time on interdependent systems. And the only way to learn from it is to really study that history to see what these factors are and how they can be implemented. So if you can kind of go through that history and explain, for example, as we come to the Bitcoin white paper, what context might be important to consider when we talk about the decentralization of markets and socio-political systems.
So Paul Baran's diagram. So Paul Baran, was a researcher at the CERN. No, sorry, not CERN. Oh my God, I'm drawing a mind blank now. Help me out here. Rand Corporation. Paul Baran was a researcher at the Rand Corporation during the Cold War and wrote up, a paper. And he was, one of many researchers that did a bunch of work on resilient systems, right? And he came up with this idea of creating distributed networks as a way to create resilient communication systems where, if you take down one node, the system can actually continue to function. So you can continue to have reliable communications, even if some disaster or bomb goes off in one area or another. And that, alongside a whole bunch of other work that was happening on packets and packet switching and so on and so forth, actually led to the internet, right? So what I'm trying to do at the minute actually is to articulate it's almost like three parallel histories of decentralization, right? You've got, and I think it is important to consider three. It's not just the political and it's not just the economic, it's also the technical. And all these three histories of decentralization and thinking and practice around decentralization are very intertwined, right? So on the political level, you've got a history of decentralization that is very much tied up in democracy and democratization and thinking and practice around that. In the economic area, you've got, almost a kind of counter to that has to do with, market forces, that the idea of market forces and kind of Hayekian economics as almost like a replacement for politics. And then separately to that, you've got this history of resilient communication systems, the kind of technical form of decentralization. And all these three are kind of intertwined in very interesting ways. And there's no clear correlation. And what's also interesting about thinking about these as three separate but intertwined areas is that it also allows us to look at decentralization today and understand how decentralization in one area does not necessarily lead to decentralization in another, right? So a decentralization of technical network does not necessarily lead to decentralization of wealth. And decentralization, decentralization of markets do not necessarily lead to decentralization of political power or wealth either. So you have to kind of understand what are the actual effects across these different layers and different histories. So, you can decentralize markets and decentralize information systems and end up massively centralizing political and economic power. And that's in fact what we've seen happen, right? And that's the kind of problems the legacy problems that we're dealing with today. So that's kind of in a nutshell the outline. I mean, I feel like I'm missing a whole load of meat here. We could go into depth with quite a few of these areas. But yeah, that's the schematic that I have in my head. And then actually writing out that history is something that I'm trying to do in a concise way at the minute for an essay. But yeah. Do you have a follow-up question? I feel like I didn't quite cover your question.
What's the focus? Because I know that you're kind of like looking at a lot of different areas, but out of interest, what is the kind of core areas that you're looking at right now in your research or just the stuff that you're doing with NIMDAO?
So with NIM, NIM is a kind of slightly separate topic, but it does relate in many ways. So for context, my job is as head of strategy for NIM Technologies, which is a decentralized privacy system, and it's a kind of tokenized version of Tor, and is one way to understand it. So Tor is this fantastic privacy system that allows people to communicate online without being traced. And NIM has kind of worked a little bit on extending the capabilities there and developing a kind of new system that protects also against things like large-scale traffic analysis. And in fact incorporates a token in order to make sure that the network operates economically sustainable in the long run and economically independent from any particular funders. So that's NIM, and my main focus there in terms of strategy is understanding how privacy fits in, how privacy fits in with the kind of current data economies. So I'm trying, like the main focus right now is to work out, can privacy be a form of intervention into the highly concentrated wealth and power in current internet infrastructures? So we have a kind of situation where Web 2 obviously created like very, highly concentrated forms of power, at a corporate level and at a technical level, with, the big tech corporations owning the vast majority of data, which means the vast majority of information about, human beings on the planet right now, our social relationships and our political processes and our economic processes. And so, what I'm hoping a kind of broader movement for privacy can achieve is to put somewhat of a kind of blocker on that, and shift how we understand and act when it comes to the production of data and the exploitation of data. So the idea is a little bit, where right now we've got surveillance as the default, which means, people go online, we do a whole bunch of stuff. We do, in fact, more and more things online, everything from shopping to education to health, is becoming highly digitized. Instead of that data just leaking and, let's say surveillance or data extraction being the default, if we can arrive at a point where privacy is the default, then we can start making meaningful decisions about when data should even be produced, and who should own that data and who should control that data and for what can it be used. And those are like the, super important questions, because we're really talking about the kind of, we're really talking about the core of human society. It's, how we produce knowledge and how we kind of choose to engage with one another. And the ability to shape that should be the ability that should be something that communities and specific cultures can decide for themselves, rather than it happening without they have any say in it whatsoever. So that's kind of, I almost feel like maybe that's it is relevant to the first bit of our conversation in many ways. It's a kind of specific example, right? It's a specific case of what we were talking about earlier. What happens when you decentralize core information infrastructures and how that produces concentrations of power, and what to do about it now, and from my perspective, privacy technologies has a huge role to play in what to do about it now. Not the only role, but a big role.
And what I love about that is, I guess a lot of people in Web3 end up doing a few things at once, and it really comes around understanding various systems and finding and identifying the leverage points that have potential impact. And as you said, it's tangentially related, but by introducing privacy as a way to almost prevent the decentralization of power in many regards. I do think it relates to how you spoke. I think it was the Agorist article that was kind of going through how, looking back in time when there wasn't as much knowledge and information asymmetry, where all of the community resources was operated as the commons, and we had access basically to almost abundant resources. And then came the evolution of people privatizing and, I guess, capitalistic actors coming in to try to centralize those resources and try to sell it back to the people. And in a way, imposing that asymmetric leverage on the working class, labor, and people's livelihoods in a way. And in the same way, when we talk about privacy, reputation, it is a way to prevent people trying to extract the value that we ourselves are producing by putting our own data out there. It's just almost like a fast forward in time on a completely new use case. But if we step back and try to relate it to that transition from moving from like a commons to more of like rent-seeking capitalistic actors, and what I loved when you mentioned voluntary markets being that people don't actually have an option to participate. They almost have to because their paycheck depends on it. So we almost become these cogs in the system because that power dynamic was imposed. so many years ago, and now we're just stuck in that system. So I know those are a few threads to touch on, but what can we learn from that transition from commons, and how can that help us identify leverage points to almost reverse or completely rewire those systems?
I think what's important to learn from the commons framework is that it exactly kind of shows a counterpoint to a kind of capitalist form of exploitation, right? And it kind of makes you, when you kind of train your mind to see these dynamics happening, you start to understand markets less as a kind of natural state of affairs and more as a set of societal constructs that are created, for various reasons and with various kinds of outcomes. And oftentimes markets are created exactly through the kind of imposition of scarcity. And then you can start looking at how is scarcity actually produced? What is the violence that happens when that is created? But I also think that it's important to not get too fascinated with some kind of original, like some kind of idea of an idyllic past, because there are also like the commons. We have a kind of messy history, right? Like humanity has a messy history. There's been experiments throughout the ages of how to live together and how to live together better. And we've gone through all kinds of crazy iterations. And here I really recommend reading David Graeber's and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Humanity, which gives a fascinating overview of they basically they want to kind of tackle this question of like the origins of inequality. And then they eventually say, look, there is no origins of inequality. Humanity has always experimented with crazy, wild and inventive ways of living together. So what's important is to keep an eye on what the next step is. There's no like natural state that we can revert back to. And I think that's important to think about also when it comes to where we're at in our current organization of societies and the role of markets in societies. Because there was an attempt, and here I want to get a little bit more specific. There was kind of an attempt in the 90s to counter the spread of market dynamics also in the digital space with different types of digital commons ideas, right? And that was partially like based on the kind of historical critiques of the creation of the working class and the creation of markets and the creation of scarcity and the violence and expropriation that happened when capitalism first took hold and was part of a kind of massive colonial expansion as well. So it's partially kind of drawing on that history, that intellectual history and that critique. But it was also kind of trying to make the point that when it comes to the digital space, there is no scarcity, right? Bits can be reproduced and copied ad infinitum. And so any imposition of scarcity, like digital rights management or so on, is a form of fake violence that will eventually be surpassed by the ability of digital networks to easily reproduce themselves. And there's some truth to that, and there's definitely interesting aspects to that. But I think like the important lessons that I'm seeing some of my friends really try to kind of take seriously and put forward is the fact that we might look at bits and say that they're kind of infinitely reproducible at zero cost or near zero cost. But the work that goes into writing code isn't, right? The work that goes into producing an artwork isn't. So there is a certain kind of revision going on now around the utopia that was somewhat kind of described in the 90s of like we can create a post-scarcity society based on the digital. Because at the end of the day, we are also material. We also do live in a material world, and we do also have limitations in terms of the effort and energy as human beings and the resources that we have on Earth. So bits might be infinitely available, but lithium isn't, right? So kind of understanding a little bit that relationship between the material and the digital is like a huge task that I think we're really working through at the minute. And what's so fascinating exactly around, and about the Web3 space is is the ability to represent scarcity in the digital world in a new way, right? So where my initial reaction when Bitcoin came along and I really kind of did the deep dive into blockchain architectures, my initial reaction was coming from that kind of 90s place of like, we were supposed to go towards post scarcity. And I got so pissed off, I was like, what is this bullshit? We're going to reproduce like false scarcity and capitalist social relationships through this stupid technology. And I was hugely critical, but I actually think, the more I've kind of been in this space, the more I'm like, there's something interesting here around taking seriously the the need for scarcity or the need for limitations. To this, I know this is like very vague statements, but it's going somewhere. Trust me. But like, yeah, the need for limitations, or representation of limitations in a way. And so I think like working out the economics in this space is part of also understanding some of the bigger questions that we're faced with today, which is the limitations in natural resources, the limitations in terms of human effort, and setting some boundaries around that. That doesn't have to be capitalist, and this is the important point, right? Because the reaction to scarcity that comes from the critiques from the 90s and going all the way back to early critiques of colonialism and capitalist expansion is a critique of scarcity in a capitalist form, and so the kind of the economics of the future is to really look post capitalist and understanding scarcity in a radically different way than we do today. I think that somewhat answered a little bit of it. It covered some topics.
No, I love it. As you talk, there's like 3 or 4 topics that we can go down. And I love that you bringing in the combination of material and digital and the concept of scarcity. Interestingly enough, I've always linked scarcity with almost the source of power accrual. We were chatting with Andy and we were talking about how this vision of collective abundance that Web3 always talks about is almost this utopic coercion, as you mentioned, to kind of paint this rosy picture, get people coerced into believing that that's possible. And then whether it's programmatically done or if it's done through institutions, slowly trying to extract the value based on people's hopes that it's even possible. So when we think about scarcity and almost think of human behavior as being inevitably steered towards trying to accrue power as soon as it gets a taste of it, I do sometimes play out the potential Black Mirror scenarios that people will inevitably introduce scarcity into these systems. And hopefully, as we run multiple simulations, the market, but hopefully this time it's actually the people that are choosing which of these simulations are most beneficial for society, we end up choosing the ones that don't introduce this power dynamic of fake scarcity. So kind of moving towards a little bit of how power links to scarcity, whether it's in the technology access, whether it's in the political access or the market access, where do you think the decentralization of power comes in? Because it's obviously not just equations that we can program in and say solve for lowest power accrual. Is that the social behavioral layer? Is it a cultural thing that we introduce with a WAGMI culture? Or is that almost moving towards utopic coercion?
Let me think how to best answer that. There's something about there's something right now that I find very important, and this might seem a little bit vague to people, but I think it's very important to be as real as possible now. So one of the reasons why I am kind of anti-utopian, very explicitly anti-utopian, is because it's, whenever you kind of write up a utopia, it tends to be very much a kind of a fixed vision of a perfect world where everyone behaves perfectly, And it's like it's one of the most violent things, because it doesn't actually take into account the reality of people's lives, right? It usually is some kind of like fictitious picture that exists in some kind of nowhere, which I believe is the etymology of utopia anyway. Um, and it has the weird effect of kind of blinding people to being very honest and real about the present, right? And that's another kind of thing that I'm trying to articulate a little bit better at the moment, is that there's something about the real and there's something about the present that is more important than ever before. So, we've been caught up for the past like couple of decades at least, and maybe even the past century, to be honest, in a kind of extreme future focused orientation and an extreme utopian driven orientation. So it's been this constant projection, rush towards projection, another projection, rush towards that projection. Instead of being able to and daring to look at exactly what's happening right here now in the present and what the next step is. And that to me seems to be the kind of important way to go about doing things. And I mean that even from this kind of idea of decentralization, how to decentralize power, and then just like, okay, what does decentralized power look like? And then I've seen a lot of awkward and ugly attempts to decentralize power in like small collectives and larger collectives, exactly because people get caught up in processes and procedures for how to do that. So it's almost as if like, when you set up the problem of like, okay, how are we going to decentralize power? And then we invent some kind of procedural mechanism that's going to, make sure we solve that problem of decentralizing power once and for all. And then anything that doesn't adhere to that process and procedure that we've set up, which is going to solve this problem, gets kind of violently rejected. And I've seen this happen, at large scale and small scales over and over again. And so there's something that isn't working about that. There's something that isn't working about this kind of procedural, process-driven, or maybe even the kind of algorithmic and network mode of decentralization. And I actually think that we somehow, right now, I'm working. I think, like I said earlier in the conversation, on an essay on decentralization that tries to flesh some of this stuff out. And I'm blaming Paul Baran's diagram for a lot of these problems. But yeah, I think this diagram does have a lot of blame. But yeah, so it's and I guess to try and kind of talk through that a little bit more. The way I see it is something along the lines of that. Once you kind of decided that decentralizing power is the thing that we need to do, and then you create a diagram that's going to achieve, the decentralization of power. That diagram and that process and procedure in itself is actually it's a particular form of process and procedure. Like, it's not neutral, right? So whether we're talking about the market system that's supposed to decentralize power, or a democratic parliament that's supposed to decentralize power, or an information network that's supposed to decentralize power, like, these are three modes of engaging and being in the world. Like, not everyone has the ability to speak effectively in a democratic parliament, right? Not everyone has the ability to engage effectively in market dynamics, right? Not everyone has the ability to, make the most of information networks, or get involved in coding them or running them themselves. Like, these are particular skills that allow particular people to concentrate their power and their way of engaging in the world through these mechanisms, right? So where does that leave us? That leaves us in this awkward place where we're like, oh my God, every solution we try and come up with that's supposed to decentralize power is going to be just another, not universal, not neutral, but just another very particular way of doing things that's going to benefit some actors over another, right? You end up into this kind of like nihilist soup of like, where do we go from here kind of thing. but I think that's kind of I think it's an important to me. It's a very important realization, because then we can start looking at what are the specific things that each of these systems can actually do that is particular, right? So there's nothing universal about the market. There's nothing universal about the parliament. There's nothing universal about information networks. But these three forms of decentralization can do very interesting things, and we can start to kind of like flesh those out and say like, okay, so maybe they're good for arranging this form of societal dynamic, but not this another form. And of course, in reality, that is the way that things are, right? So, I mean, we don't want markets to be determining everything about our social and political realities. We do want to have some element of parliamentary control over that. We don't want information networks to be the only means through which people make decisions. Do you know what I mean? It's like we can have a division of functions across these mediums, but by understanding that they're not universal, it makes us more aware of what they can do and what they can do well, and which actors benefit the most from their expansion and implementation. Now, the moment we lose sight of that, that's when the huge problem of decentralization comes in. And I'll tell you one reason why I'm against decentralization, which is that what decentralization does, and if we take the example of decentralized markets, decentralization can decentralize risk as much as anything else, and it decentralizes the reach of certain types of power dynamics. So as you expand markets into new territories, usually what that happens is you expand the reach of market dynamics into those territories, which means people who are very effective at operating within market dynamics are able to reach even more people and resources and extract from them. So I would like to kind of really push this association, like this kind of like this mental click into people's minds, like whoever's listening, when you hear the word decentralization, don't just think like, oh, beautiful, decentralized power, democratization, this and that. No, decentralization is also a spread of power. It's like it's a reach of power that goes even further into new areas, new communities, and transform them into something that can be legible, that can be exploitable by a new type of actor, a new type of power dynamic. And I mean that across the board, not just in markets, but also information technologies, also parliamentary political systems. These are systems that are not neutral. There are systems that can be used by certain actors far easier and far better than other actors. And so their expansion means the expansion of the reach of those particular actors.
So what you're saying
Maybe
is
I answered your
that,
question again.
yeah, that's a really good way to. Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it, because it showcases like even within that level of, I guess, within that level of reach or whatever network effect that thing could create, that could also be misled or biased or misinformed in a way to grab more power, which actually I feel like we never really talk about when it comes to decentralization, because it in itself, it has got this like undertone of utopian lifestyle, that if we all co-lived together, if we all were on the same infrastructure, sharing that infrastructure, then surely we will all be happy, right? And it's funny,
Exactly.
you flipped it on its head, and I didn't even think of it in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, because not everyone wants to necessarily live on that infrastructure, right? And the ability to not do that is actually quite an important part of the
Yeah.
ability to be free and to live our lives the way we want to live them.
Yeah. Also, it's like this kind of the power distance that happens in a lot of economies, and also like the cultural side of it as well is kind of somewhat neglected. Where just quickly from like a Web3 hat perspective, it's kind of like we are going into these other societies and economies with our like decentralized and DAO thinking, and then trying to onboard these communities into that level of thinking, because we assume that that's the way that they could have better peer-to-peer infrastructures, or leapfrog across like certain economies, right? Especially developed ones. And so like the culture undertone is not really ever really addressed, where you do see a lot of people in the space that don't know much about certain countries, let alone ever been there, trying to provide some guidebooks on how they should better live their lives. So I think that
Yep, it's a
that
classic.
reality check, yeah, right, that reality check is important. On that topic though, what is the relevancy on culture? Like, what are the cultures that you feel you've been exposed to that have given you this kind of taste on, maybe somewhat equal taste across some of the areas that you look at, from a societal and cultural perspective as well?
I mean, I think it's let me think about that for a second. I think I've been exposed to quite a lot of different cultures, and I mean, if you'll forgive me to make it like a little bit kind of like autobiographical, kind of talk a little bit about my own upbringing. I grew up I grew up in a kind of in a spiritual sect that was that originated out of India. So my parents were very much part of the hippie generation, but were absolutely devotees of this kind of path. But what that meant was I grew up in Scandinavia. So there was this kind of like this dual life almost of like living on the one hand in my kind of home life. And I think like a lot of immigrant kids kind of like experience this, where you have your home life, which is like just radically different from the mainstream society that you're growing up in. So, in Copenhagen, Denmark, in the kind of like 90s, the only thing that people knew about spirituality, this was before yoga and meditation became kind of hipster. The only thing that people kind of knew about spirituality was like, various kind of stories about like crazy sects that, brainwash people and stuff. So those were the like media headlines. So I had this kind of like home life that was like extremely different from the outside world. The mainstream Danish society that was extremely Christian and extremely secular. And then I had this constant flow of people from all over the world that would come and stay with us, because there were people practicing this faith across all of the world. So we had people from Latin America, China, Eastern Europe, whatever, just passing through the house and staying there. And so I, knew from a very young age that I was probably going to like move out of Denmark, because it just felt a little bit kind of claustrophobic in that sense. And then coming to London, which is a fantastic city exactly because there are so many people from all over the world. And you can, I really enjoy that experience where, you meet someone and you talk to someone, and it just blows your mind because like their perspective and their way of being in the world is so radically different from yours, right? And London just allows that to happen over and over and over again. And so I think just kind of being around people from not just different countries, but also different class backgrounds. I went to a very working class university initially when I went to London, which was an ex-polytechnic. And then right after that went to the London School of Economics. So I kind of had this like, and then did my PhD in the Northeast. So, you meet, people from all these different kind of class backgrounds as well. And just being in the UK and learning about class, coming from a very middle class background in Scandinavia was also very eye-opening. So I think it's just, when you pay attention to these encounters, and you take them seriously, then it becomes very clear that like, well, there's a large part of the world that just, they don't have smartphones and don't care about having one, right? There's a large part of the world that like has no idea what crypto is and is just not that interested. And people that are struggling with other problems and other kind of questions in their lives. And so it becomes much more, you become a bit more kind of like real about what the role of this tech is in society. And that's not to say that like this tech can't do anything good or interesting for people. I absolutely think it can. And there are like for all the kind of like hype around, I do think there are serious use cases around censorship resistance and around the ability for people to organize economically independently of whatever malicious state they live under. Like there are very good use cases for this technology, but there is the problem that you mentioned of people actually not looking carefully enough at what those use cases really are, and making a lot of assumptions about how to save people with the tech. And I think that's not to say that kind of like there is a word to describe it, which is just tech colonialism, and but I would say it's not that many people in Web3 are necessarily malicious or don't care about what's really the issues that people in other cultures are dealing with. I think it's a combination of laziness, but also a lack of skill. So when you're a coder, then you're not a social scientist, right? You're not necessarily someone that has the skill set and ability to go out and listen to people and understand what's really going on for them. That's in fact a skill set in itself, and it's a skill set that is sorely lacking in not just the Web3 space, but in the tech industry at large. Although it does seem like the tech industry is learning. And I definitely know a handful of anthropologists who do work regularly with large tech companies exactly to address some of this stuff.
Can we go back into the upbringing stuff and that kind of stories, because like there was because I just think you're so real, and like it's really important just to kind of talk about those things a bit more.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about I guess the environment of your kind of upbringing in that environment alone, but also the feminist groups that you went to see in Spain, somewhat anarchist feminist groups, then you kind of managed to speak a lot of, I guess, across a lot of topics with them. But talk about those kinds of areas, because I just really want to hear that.
Sure. So am I talking about anarcho-feminists, or am I talking about religious sects? Or
Okay. Yeah, go back to the story of your upbringing originally, and then if you want to tap into because the reason why I wanted to ask about the feminist group was because it was tying into something else I was thinking about. But yeah, maybe start off with your kind of upbringing story first.
Well, what do you want me to expand on exactly? I mean, I mentioned kind of briefly being what like kind of a bit more on the like home environment, or in Denmark, or how I got involved in politics, or what would you like to know?
Yeah, like I guess like
that I haven't
what was
said
that
already?
like from a kind of cultural exposure perspective, and then how that then tied, because I think like, I mean, personally myself, like I would be really interested in these types of like, because from my upbringing perspective, it was always very much politics at the dinner table, because of background,
Right.
and I guess our family's backgrounds, it was just always like things like politics, and I guess like cultural implications of certain things was always very important to talk about at the dinner table. And so that then kind of moved you towards wanting to be exposed to like different groups that were somewhat out of the ordinary, but like maybe harder to find or reach. But really it was more kind of bumping into these like underground groups, because of the fact that you had, that you might have had this previous like influence by generations before, or your like parents, for example. It's like, how did that then merge you into this other world in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, so in terms of the dinner table, there was definitely, me and my dad discussed a lot of politics. But then there was also always the metaphysics element, right? Because, my parents are deeply spiritual and very much part of, they have a very strong kind of meditation practice. And so there was always that kind of, I guess like that's definitely informed my thinking. So like I'm not, I'm not a straightforward political scientist, and it's not just politics that I'm interested in. I'm also kind of interested in how where that comes from, right? In terms of deeper meaning for people. So, like, I guess, like, it created an interest in how people form meaning about, like, form concepts of meaning and learn how to inhabit the world, right? So I think that it kind of like it's definitely added that layer for me. And the fact that from a very young age I had to kind of navigate that, dealing with adults kind of not understanding why I ate a certain kind of food or why I spoke in a certain kind of way. And learning how to kind of be silent and sometimes and speak out and other times, because people would not be like, being very aware of like people's mental framework. So it's like, okay, this person will not understand this set of concepts, so I'm not going to go there. Or this person, so it's almost like being able to hold multiple universes in your mind at once, so that you understand the kind of like the structures of meaning that people inhabit, and how to navigate those structures of meaning that different people inhabit in an effective way. So I think that's kind of like, that's what my upbringing taught me, because there was so much discrepancy between the different types of realities that I was experiencing from an adult, the adults were speaking to me as when I was a child, right? And then I think from there, I got very interested in how to bridge those different structures of meaning and how to articulate those bridges. And I think that's kind of probably very much what I'm still trying to do. So, it's like understanding these, these different histories and different cultures and the ways to kind of like speak the bridges between them, in a sense. Yeah. And then I became an anarcho-feminist. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, before we go into the feminist angle, what I really enjoy hearing about in terms of actually understanding how the cultural upbringing almost gets reflected in a set of values that you approach the world with. I personally grew up in quite a religious environment, not for the sake of the religion itself, but because it espoused the values that seem to be in the right direction. And what I've noticed is, whether it's religious, whether it's spiritual, whether it's metaphysical, in terms of really believing that our actions impact others and other people's net gain can also positively influence us, whether directly in this physical world or something in the metaphysical side of things. I guess coming down to the values of it, do you find that certain cultures, whether it's the previous cultures or the new ones that we establish moving forward, have a direct impact of setting the set of values and value alignment that we incorporate into the decentralized autonomous organizations that we launch? Because I think that cultural layer that sets those values is really the only thing that could hold us together, rather than it just being all dependent on market dynamics. So could you touch on a little bit on how values come from culture, if you do agree with that?
I do agree with that. But I think we're at to me anyway, it seems like we're in a kind of metaphysical crisis right now as humanity. And I do blame capitalism for that. And a little bit the way that I kind of see it, or the way that I kind of sense it, is and not just capitalism, neoliberalism in a sense, and maybe even liberalism. I mean, liberalism has a lot of good sides to it, but there's something about this idea that this kind of, okay, so we have, people, all these differences across cultures, this and that, whatever, and then the only thing that ties us together is, the market dynamics, and then again, market dynamics plus like a little bit of maybe social democracy, and somehow, and then when you look at kind of the actual, what I like to think about is like the touch points, right? So what are the actual touch points that people have that are common, that are shared? So we've come to a situation where religion is considered a specific and individual choice, so that's kind of like relegated to the individual, and then the kind of things that remain are a little bit like social democracy, but that's kind of been eroded over time. So the democratic institutions are also eroded, and then you have kind of like, okay, markets is something that we all interact with on a regular basis, which is shared, right? So transactions is something that a lot of us are engaging in, and that's our kind of shared language. And then what else? Now we've got social media, right? So then social media becomes the kind of touch point. So we've got these, I think a useful and interesting way to look at things is like, what are the shared touch points that we're all engaging with on a daily basis that hold us together, almost like the glue in society, right? So religion kind of has fallen away as the glue, for like at a hegemonic level anyway. It still exists very strongly in pockets and groups. Faith groups are huge. But in terms of those kinds of touch points that cut across differences, you see transactions and you see social media. And it's somehow an incredibly vacuous space in terms of deeper meaning, and in terms of kind of connection and sense of belonging. It's a if you think about the kind of ways that social media operates, when it comes to kind of profiling and targeting algorithms, like the kind of content that you get fed, like the actual content, the content of the content is like completely irrelevant to the algorithm. The only thing that's relevant is like the continuous engagement, right? So it's like, are you still scrolling? Are you still looking? Are you still whatever, So that's the metaphysics of social media, is mindless engagement. So the metaphysics of social media is mindless engagement. The metaphysics of transactions is more transactions, right? The market just wants kind of more circulation, more kind of more circulation in the economy, and so the metaphysics of the general glue that ties much of humanity together right now is horrifying. I mean, it's deeply vacuous, and I think I would like to tie a lot of our kind of mental health crises and stuff to that there is a deeper sense of a loss of meaning, a deeper sense of a loss of connection, and the more that we attempt to create these kind of supposedly neutral infrastructures to somehow tie people together into some kind of coherent social groupings, it feels like we're just kind of reiterating that kind of problem. Yeah,
and I think
so.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, there was someone that I read recently, and I cannot remember his name, but he said something along the lines of that there is a lack of the cause of much. He was a mental health practitioner. He was like, the cause of much mental health crises that he experiences when he deals with depressed people is that we live in a society that does not support the process of meaning making, and that I found very interesting. And that's exactly, that's what religion used to do. That's what religion does for a lot of people. And that's why people kind of keep reaching back to religion. But I think we need to, I don't know, I'm hoping we can find some way forward and work out something new,
Yeah.
post political ideology, post religious, post market. What's the next step? Let's go.
Yeah. How deep does that go? Because that is a really alarming, like, whatever you can put like numbers on it, you can put percentages on it, but like realistically, that kind of level of depression that is sensed across like current generations or upcoming generations, like the fear that, I don't know, there is this genuine like energy that it feels very off, and you can't not necessarily avoid it or not try to feel it. So how deep can we talk about the mental health side of it? Because how deep does that really go? And what are some of the things that you're seeing that could provide some element of solution, in a micro level even?
I mean, I think it goes really deep. In terms of solutions, I think that the climate crisis is going to throw us into solutions. So the climate crisis is almost like this extremely material and extremely real wake-up call that is going to force us back into a direct relationship to reality as it exists, and make us deal with it, and that I think is going to be hopefully a very healthy thing. It could also do the opposite because as humanity kind of is faced with more and more crises, and those crises are going to play out along a lot of different vectors. I mean, the climate crisis is going to force even more waves of mass migration, massive economic crises, and so on. We're going to feel the economic crisis even earlier, I think. The way that people deal with crises at that scale, obviously it can go in both directions. Like, it forces you to come face to face with reality as it is and deal with it, but it could also force people further out into various forms of extreme fantasies and extremist fantasies. So I don't know whether that takes the form of extremist I don't know, new forms of superstition or whatever else, but I think we'll probably see both. But I do see a way forward there. I do see a kind of a very healthy solution there, that also brings people back into touch with a universe and a world that is much bigger than the human. And that's one of the kind of problems I also think that exists with the fact that we've ended in a situation where markets and algorithmic information systems are the only glue. If you think about markets and you think about algorithmic information systems, they are a product of our own minds, right? So they're a kind of, and they're almost this kind of like deep navel gazing of humanity, to the exclusion of all else, right? To the exclusion of all other forms of life and ways of being in the planet. And so, the breakthrough of the climate crisis is almost this reminder that actually, there is more outside of our own neuroses. There are far more, beings and consciousness and, animals, plants, minerals. There is a reality beyond us, and that reality is like, yo, wake up. It's kind of. I think that will push us back into, that could push us back into a kind of more healthy state of mind.
Yeah, and I like that you brought in the climate crisis in a way, because it is one of the biggest symptoms that everyone can almost sense, feel, and it's not diluted by almost the mindless social media content curation that's not based on meaningful value. There's an element of sense making that is also missing, that makes everything a little bit more difficult to understand, like what's the right thing to do, what's actually happening. So trying to link a little bit and blame capitalism as well. So I'll make sure I link it back to that. But in a way, as I understand it, if we see the market as this decentralized information processor, it is a way to process information, but as we're saying, it's not actually accurate. It's almost mindless. And if we bank on this mindless flow of understanding and energy, we will have symptoms like climate crisis, depression that we're facing. And you briefly touched on this, where you said, in a way, if we really try to decentralize power, it would come down to people with the right skill, reputation, and knowledge being able to synthesize that information and help steer, not necessarily the market, but part of the sense making of what's actually happening, what could potentially steer us in the right direction. And obviously we can't come up with solutions here. It would be awesome if we could, but if we think of it as a way of saying, is there a new type of market that has a cultural OS built in, that is able to identify based on people's reputation what how to, I guess, curate content, how to sense make actual facts and knowledge to at least steer the market in the right direction, it almost feels like it's imposing a certain forced mechanism design, which could have worse consequences. So it almost makes me think, is it better to try to overthink a solution or just see where it ends up and just be part of watching this wild Netflix special that we call humanity?
Yeah, that in short answer to your last question, that depends on the scale that you're operating in, right? So usually when you design networks, networks are oftentimes, not always, and some networks are designed very differently, but oftentimes designed with the network effects in mind, right? So networks are effective and useful because they're big, and the more people join, the better for the entire network. So when you're developing a system that is going to operate at scale, of course you want to be to overthink it. You want to be super rigorous with what it is that you're creating. And working at NIM, we have quite a lot of conversations about this. There's a phenomenal computer scientist that I recommend, and an information security expert that I recommend everyone follow, Carmela Troncoso. She's one of our advisors, and she works. So her and Chelsea, and recently also Chelsea and myself in a talk, we kind of brought up this this analogy of, like, when you have doctors that are treating patients, they go through a rigorous process of training about how to do so safely and how to deal with patients also ethically, and they have to take a Hippocratic oath, right? Because they literally have a person's life in their hands. And then you have, computer scientists and developers that are creating networks that directly impact, millions and billions of people's lives. And they do so with very little oversight, very little scrutiny. And so it's, kind of making that analogy, becomes clear that, like, okay, there is a certain rigor that needs to be implemented in the tech industry that acknowledges the actual level of impact that tech has on many people's lives today. So that's one thing where I think, like, scale, makes a big difference. If you're tinkering and experimenting with a bit of code that you and your mates are going to, like, try out and have some fun with, and it's like, man, just go for it. Don't overthink it, just roll with it. And you can run simulations and have all kinds of fun. But the moment it gets deployed and actually affects real people's lives, then there needs to be a far more rigorous process than there is today. On the stuff that you were saying before that, which was, remind me again, it was on, we were back at networks again. What were we talking? What did you mention?
We're talking about sense making, kind of trying to do some kind of mechanism design.
And exactly. So, and the market as an information processor. So this is a, whoops, sorry, it was on my phone. Let me just quickly check what's going on. Apologize. Brief moment of pause. Yeah. Hello? I think I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So the network as an information processor and mechanism design. So let's start with the network as an information processor. This was an idea that was put forward by the economist Friedrich von Hayek. And, speaking of kind of interesting diagrams, I find Hayek, like, super fascinating to read. But I'm also extremely aware of the horrors that his writing left behind in terms of real world implementation. So, Hayek, is basically one of the initial thinkers that put forward the idea of decentralized markets being more effective forms of information processors to process information about the resources and needs across society, right? And so what are the problems with that is, as we've seen, various iterations of Hayekian economics being implemented, there's been various forms of market failures and market externalities where the market is not able to take into account uh, um, the way that resources are extracted from certain places, and it's not able to take into account the inability for people to operate effective or engage effectively with the market, right? So there is no kind of equal form of engagement with these types of dynamics, and certain people have different starting places, to put it simply, as well. We could do a whole podcast looking at market failures and market externalities, but the interesting thing about markets as an information processor, though, if we look at it purely from an information perspective, or look at it from a kind of accounting perspective even, is that it assumes that the market, in order for the market to operate effectively as an information processor, it is intolerant of other forms of coordination, right? Meaning, if the market is going to, what skews a market, as a kind of information construct, what skews it is if people start to collude around certain information, right? So people are talking to each other outside of the market dynamics. They can do things like price fixing or whatever else. And what happens then is it skews the kind of effects of the market, and it starts to fail as a system for effectively distributing resources across the space, because of price manipulation and otherwise. So just as an example. So what that means is that the market, it forces a certain kind of set of policies around it to protect this idea of the market as a perfect information processor, where people become increasingly forced to do all their business via a single market system. And it also assumes that more and more information needs to enter into the market, because anything that's outside of the market is not taken into account, right? So if you think of it as kind of, how, if the market is the best way to process information in society, that then leads to the idea that we need more and more information to be shoved into the market in order for it to do so effectively. And then hence you can see how that kind of then expands into a whole data extractivist kind of process, and so on and so forth. So there's an inbuilt expansionary tendency in the idea, in this Hayekian idea, which becomes super wild and even metaphysical if you take it to its extreme, because you start to think about what is the limits of information, really, and at what point does the market have complete information? At no point does the market have complete information is the quick answer, right? Which means that there's always going to be market failures. There's always going to be that outside of the market that is failed to be taken into account. And when you fail to take something into account in the market system, that becomes an externality very quickly, and you start to see, all these knock-on effects. And here we are today with, kind of extreme concentration of wealth and insane kind of surveillance system, and ecological crises. So, and I blame a lot of that on on Hayek, not everything, but a lot. I mean, you can blame part of it on Adam Smith and other people too, but that is kind of in a nutshell, the issue of, if you think of the market as the only information processor, the best information processor, and therefore the way to organize society. But what's interesting is that, okay, so this was an idea that was tried out, in the 80s by Thatcher and Reagan and various others, and you see iterations of it, coming again through neoliberalism. And you've always had this kind of social democratic backlash with the state trying to regulate markets. And then what's interesting today is that we've arrived at this place that is not looking at the market as a universal information processor, but as a particular form of information processor, and an information processor that can be designed in bespoke ways. So, and here we come to mechanism design, right? And this I find to be much more interesting. So, understanding markets more as just another tool that we have for organizing, various parts of society. It's not like the metaphysical way to, account for humanity's, needs and wants in the universe, but is more a set of social organizing tools that can be designed for bespoke purposes. This, I think, like we're still in the middle of experimenting with that. We're still in the middle of building that out. And I'm quite curious to know, how that goes. I think there are definitely, some positive outcomes that we can see in that area. But it's an open, it's an open field. I don't have a final conclusion on that at all yet. I think the Web3 space is fascinating exactly because it's kind of taken like these kind of like these big conflicts in political thinking, where it's like market versus the state, or democracy versus capitalism, or and these kind of, or the right versus the left even, and is doing this wild mashup where it's like, let's play around and see what we can make of this stuff. And I applaud that, and I think that's interesting. I also think that it's important for that space to understand the legacies. And again, we come back to the beginning of our conversation to really look into some of the histories where these things have been tried out before and what's gone wrong, right? And both politically and economically. Yeah.
And maybe to double click, just because I think we've been talking with some context and background in terms of what a market failure could be from either asymmetric information or collusion, or just inevitable nature that knowledge is not necessarily disseminated throughout the market fairly. Could you find an example that would touch on a market failure that has to do with some kind of lack of data or lack of knowledge being passed to all the actors in the market? Because my mind goes to the interdependence on the market and the state, where the state is building up institutions that will govern how the market can behave. So it's almost some kind of mechanism design. And I wonder if the problem is truly just lacking collective intelligence, where all the knowledge is shared to everyone, so that the market can either behave in a way that it's not just based on selfish needs, it's also understanding other people's needs. Really broad question, but what idea or thought gets inspired as an example of that?
I mean, so the problem is that that information will never be shared equally. Like, it's just impossible in practice, because the question of what is the relevant information in the market changes so often, and people's ability to kind of process that information and act effectively on it is so unequally distributed. So like it's a little bit of a kind of myth that is like, it's useful in certain scenarios, that like, if you think of markets, in a kind of within like market competition within a kind of limited area, that's completely fine, but not as a kind of broader societal like the only broader societal principle. So you can think of, if you look at things like the privatization of railroads and social housing in the UK, you can kind of see market failures happen in real time. So the housing market is notorious for that. You can have a flourishing housing market and massive homelessness at the same time. In fact, it usually is the case, because the housing market enters into a kind of financialized circuit that has less to do with providing people with an actual house and has more to do with providing speculators with some extra money. And so what happens there is the state steps in as the kind of an institution, or what happens in certain circumstances is a state might step in and say actually, regardless of what happens, regardless of what the market says, people need houses, people need food, people need education. And in fact, if people don't get that, then they don't have any way of engaging effectively with any market. You just have kind of rampant inequality. and the market will eventually destroy itself and destroy its base. So because this is another thing that I think is important for people to understand, is that the relationship between markets and states have always been a kind of symbiosis. They're not in opposition to one another in the way that libertarians like to present it.
Yeah, so I guess two sides of this is, based on all of the things that we've discussed, we've kind of touched on mechanism design, but I'd be interested to get your thoughts on just generally token engineering and how we can build incentives, and almost start thinking about behavioral incentives being part of the systems we create. And it doesn't need to be like a huge scaled system that we're building. Personally, Maz and I are working on the project called CrowdMuse, and we look at different supply chains. So whether it's fashion, energy, and we're trying to think of how to engineer tokens that provide a sense of collective growth, so that even if one node, for example, isn't growing because of whatever product sales or whatever it is, they still benefit if they add value to the entire network. I wonder what you're thinking about in terms of just designing systems using these cool primitives that now we have in terms of smart contracts and tokens.
I mean, I would be interested to hear more about your token designs, what you're building out. I mean, because on a practical level, the system that I'm obviously most familiar with is the NIM token economics, right? And there it's all about focusing. I think what's interesting in general about token economics is obviously the fact that you're engineering a token dynamic that is trying to achieve a very specific goal, right? And that is, again, to go back to what we were talking about just a minute ago, that is like quite radically different from trying to engineer a market to become like the god of humanity and organized social relationships in general, right? And that's quite an important distinction to make, also in the Web3 space, because sometimes people do get quite metaphysical about crypto economics and the ability of blockchain systems to become the new logics of human dynamics in general. But to get so the specific is what's interesting, right? To get into the kind of specifics. And so in the NIM system, the aim there of the token economics is to make sure that the nodes that operate the network do so well, meaning that they actually provide a good quality of service, meaning that they're actually effectively mixing the data packets that they're supposed to mix, that they have good uptime. And in order to do that, there's a kind of internal reputation score that the token maintains. So each, and then it kind of involves a broader community of token holders by through a kind of staking mechanism. So anyone who's holding a NIM token can get involved in staking on mixed nodes, which is a way for them to kind of signify or show that they actually believe that this mixed node is a good actor. And that this mixed node is going to continue to maintain good uptime. And people who are staking have an economic interest to stake because they earn a share of the rewards from that mixed node. So, if the mixed node performs badly and starts to receive lower rewards, then people will stake their tokens somewhere else. And so there's a kind of like a logic there that's very much there to, in a sense, harness a somewhat pessimistic view on human tendencies, but to harness the kind of a profit motive in a sense, to ensure that there's like overall good quality of the privacy network. And then there is, additional aspects to that. So, it's not, the token is not the only way to kind of signify what's going on in the network. So mixed nodes can also showcase, what kind of what lies behind their operations. So if they're a small node operator that's associated with an NGO, for example, that has a very good reputation, they can signify that, and that can also help increase their stake and their reputation in the network. So, the token is not the only form of reputation. There's also a kind of social layer to it. So yeah, that's trying to kind of when I talk about this system, it's interesting to bridge like you have these kind of people in, especially on the left, that can be kind of very like critical of market dynamics and critical of economics disciplines, and see, crypto economics and token economics only through that lens. And I find it interesting to kind of explain to them that there's something more going on here than just, another market and just another kind of, it's not, tokens is not money exactly, right? There's something more going on there. And that's what I'm really curious to see how that plays out. And I think, with tokens not being money, but serving also information security functions, it makes it kind of slightly different than pure economics. Because it is also serving information security functions. And then when you look at non-fungible tokens, it's serving not just information security functions, but also cultural functions, like very explicitly cultural functions. So I love, when people mix in not just like token economics, but also, NFTs to create that sense of membership and that sense of belonging and whatever else. Like, I think there's a lot of like fun stuff there.
What are some of the kind of, I guess, what were some of the hypotheses that you initially came up with as a team or as a DAO? And I guess what are some of the theses or some of the, I guess, outcomes you're seeing from that level of thinking? Like, how did this formulate from a thinking perspective? And where are those experimentations right now? Are you live with this level of experimentation? Is it?
Yeah. So the NIM mixnet is live, and the token was launched. The token, there was a public sale in February, and then first distribution in April, and then there's been kind of vesting happening over the past few months that will go forward over the next few years. So the token is live. The token economics is live. In terms of learnings, like the main thing is, first of all, the mixed-net token economics is slightly different from a lot of the rest of the blockchain space, because it's a mixed-net, not a blockchain. And we have a blockchain that maintains part of it, but people kind of confuse certain concepts a little bit. So there was definitely an educational phase where people had to get used to what it means to stake in the mixed-net. And there's still a lot of clarification of concepts that I need to like push through a lot better. So, for example, when you say the word reputation and people know that you're a privacy system, people usually freak out, right? They're like, "What the hell? What do you mean reputation? That's surveillance. That means I don't want people to know things about me." When actually, it's a very specific, it's reputation for the node operators only, right? And so we make this distinction between like the infrastructure and end users. So the infrastructure needs to be transparent, because that's essentially, it's a system that people will be using and people are dependent on. So they need to know how that system operates, and they need to know, everything from the code through to the distribution of node operators across the world has to be transparent in order for the infrastructure to be secure. And so like making that distinction between like NIM is not a reputation system. NIM has a reputation system for the infrastructure in order to make sure that the infrastructure provides privacy for the end users. So that's definitely a learning. And then I think the other big learning, which is probably common across like the whole crypto space, is I've been trying to find a good way to kind of formulate this, but it's something along the lines of like, if you use economic incentives, you will be incentivizing like economics. I mean, essentially, like people, if you're like, what you realize in a token sale is like everyone, you'll get this influx of people that like want the token, and they don't actually care about the project whatsoever. So they're there for the token, they're there for the price. That's it. And so converting that initial interest in like, can I get rich fast kind of mentality into something that is longer term, more meaningful engagement with the project, a more meaningful engagement with the value that's being produced, a kind of a shift from a hype around fictitious value towards a longevity in terms of real value. That's like the big challenge. And I think every single crypto project has that challenge, so that, and that's kind of what we're in the middle of right now, is to create a community that has less to do with speculative value and is more to do with an interest in the project
What
overall.
is some of the have you had any kind of legal barriers, or is there any kind of certain legal framework that you're using for like the registration of this? Because I guess the legal side of it is also something that we don't necessarily talk much about in the past. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a whole
Yeah.
that's a whole other fascinating topic, because there is a kind of a lot of wishful thinking, or like hope in the crypto space of being like somewhat hovering above, in a network space above jurisdictions, right? And then every once in a while the law reminds you that like no. People get arrested and shut down and whatever else. And it's it's important to respect the law, and it's important to understand where and when you need to resist the law. I'm for democracy. I'm absolutely for, I'm interested in the legal institution as a way of kind of expressing democratic will and so on, but also very aware of like the need for disobedience, right? And yeah, which I guess has been more my field, if I'm going to be honest. So on a very practical level, NIM Technologies, the company, is incorporated in Switzerland, and we steer clear of the United States as much as we possibly can, for very good reasons. I mean, not just because of the kind of immediate legal risks that when we're seeing the kinds of arrests that have been taking place around the Tornado Cash case and that kind of thing, but also because we do want to pose a counterbalance to the tech vision that has been imposed from the United States and the rest of the world. And so we're trying to place more and more emphasis in partnerships elsewhere. And the vision of an alternative future for the internet, I think it is originating more in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa than the U.S. So this is kind of our bet, let's say.
That's interesting. It's interesting because, like, from a sanction perspective, obviously, like what American governments have been able to do, for 30 years to 50 years to like whatever amount of years they had the ability to be able to sanction certain nations, and the inability to, well, I guess it was kind of down to the fact that from an Iran perspective, from a Venezuela perspective, from a Cuba perspective, taking them off the international trade and the ability to trade under the central currency in a sense, or the governing currency, and then crippling those economies internally if they domestically don't have resources to like even kind of trade within themselves. So from even from like obviously money into those kinds of economies, if you're somewhat at all trying to work with an Iranian business or a business in Venezuela, if there's any kind of ties that you have with American law or a customer in America, you cannot work with these nations. And so that level of like suppression and inflation and post-recession that creates within those economies is still not necessarily like recognized by a lot of people that either don't have a connection with those nations or don't even live in those countries. So that is really important to actually address. Not to say like we're trying to cripple the people within that country. It's more kind of like how can this level of impose of sanctions still continue to this day without it ever being uplifted?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And we have a lot of Iranian friends and a lot of people that we collaborate very closely with in Latin America that experience these things on a regular basis. So it is at the forefront of our minds, exactly. And we're, I don't know if you saw, but we have a new advisor, Andrés Arauz, who is the former presidential candidate in Ecuador, who's extremely vocal around the dominance of the dollar in global economies and around sanctions, and around the right of countries to be able to determine their own innovation policies and their own economic policies. And so he's working closely with us to kind of flesh out a little bit the direction in that area.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good.
Cool. We got around
Thank
a lot.
you, man. That was amazing. Any last words you wanna? Anything like any other words of wisdom you wanna spit out before, like, do a mic drop moment if you want.
I should have written down a couple, the final lines. I think I don't know. I've talked a lot. I think I've said a lot. Yeah. Hopefully it was interesting, and very open to continue having these conversations with anyone that wants to get in touch. So
Amazing.
Yeah.
Love you, Jaya.
Yeah.
It was
Love
so
you
good to see
too.
your
Thanks
face.
for the invitation.
Thank you.